So welcome to lesson 2.6, Sociological Dimensions. Now, the things I'm going to be talking about are discussed in more detail in my book, The Phoenix Principle and the Coming Dark Age, which was never published, but you can find copies online. And we're not going to be using them explicitly in this course, not least because this course is not about my ideas, but about theoretical history in general. But they're nevertheless something useful for us to be aware of because they help us think about socio-historical phenomena in a way that ensures we don't miss anything out. So let's start with the political economic and social dimensions. Now, we often hear this phrase coming out of people's mouths. People talk about the political, economic, social, this and that. Perhaps the political, economic and social consequences of the Second World War. Or someone might say, this book deals with the political, economic and social characteristics of Chinese civilization. So people recognize that there are these three dimensions, political, economic and social. And the suggestion is that we take them seriously, as those are the three dimensions of society and history. And the reason that we have those three dimensions is because they correspond to the three and only three ways in which we can influence each other's behaviour. So you can influence someone's behaviour by making them do something. You force them to do it, and we call that a coercive relationship, and that corresponds to the political dimension. So the political dimension is all about governments, rulers, laws, police, armies, courts and prisons. That's all the political side of life. It's not voluntary whether you obey the law. You are forced to obey the law, else you will be dragged off to jail. Then the second way we can influence someone's behaviour is by offering them something to do something for us in exchange. So we say, I'll do this for you if you do this for me. And I call that a contractual relationship. There's a contract. I'll do this in return for you doing that. And that is all the economic side of life. So economic side of life is all about buying and selling. Going into a shop, you give the shopkeeper some money in return for the goods that they supply to you. Or when you're working for an employer, you provide your labour in return for your wages. So the economic life is all about these contractual relationships. And to put it another way round, all the contractual relationships are in society are what we sum up as the economic dimension of society. And then the third way we can influence someone's behaviour is that they do something for us anyway, because they like us, they care about us. They feel that our happiness is part of their happiness. They can't be happy if we're unhappy. And I call this a cooperative relationship. So it's a kind of relationship you get in families and societies and charities and in the church, where you share values with your fellow members of society, and you care about them and you want to help them out. That's all the cooperative side of life, and that's the social dimension of society. And the point is then that these are the only three ways we can influence another person's behaviour, but they are three distinct ways. They certainly feel distinct to us, and so that is why we end up with just three dimensions. And perhaps you may think, oh well, that's rubbish. I'm sure I can think of another way of influencing someone's behaviour. but I would argue that if you do, you'll only find that it's really just another way of describing one of these, or it may be some kind of combination of the two. But these are the three really conceptually distinct ways of influencing behaviour. Now, to describe the overall strength and pattern of coercive relationships in society, I use the term integration. So, if there is a strong political authority in a society who's able to exert strong coercive pressures on the rest of society, it means that society is unified. There is basically a single brain. The direction the society goes in is determined by that ruling entity that's able to coerce the rest of society to behave in certain ways. The society functions as a unit, as opposed to if there weren't strong coercive relationships and people just did what they wanted, then you'd have a set of separate factions, each trying to take the society in its own direction. So coercive relationships measure or rather integration measures the strength of coercive relationships, and stronger coercive relationships mean that society is more unified or more integrated. So we can talk of the political integration of society. To measure the strength and pattern of contractual relationships, I use the term organisation. So organisation refers to the concept of division into organs, like the organs of the body. There's a division of labour. They perform different functions and then they interact with each other. And that's the same as with contractual relationships in society, in the economy. We don't, there's no point if you're selling milk to buy milk. You only sell your milk to buy something that you can't do for yourself, buy clothing or something. So there's only going to be contractual relationships if there is a division of labour. In other words, if there is some organisation, and it becomes organisation when you don't just I produce milk and you produce clothing, but you exchange, so you become interdependent on each other. That's when it becomes organisation. You've got a division of labour to achieve some higher purpose in society. So that's why we use the term organisation, economic organisation. And lastly, to describe the strength of the cooperative relationships in society, I use the term cohesion. So cohesion means sticking together, and that's what cooperative relationships do. Cooperative relationships mean that we stick together with our neighbours. We care about them, we help them out, nobody's left behind. We share our goals and our values, and so we naturally want to stick together. And so we have social cohesion. And when we talked about Mary Beth Cameron's ideas of the political cycle in China, we kind of saw this somewhat, that she talked about how after a period of disorder, a short-lived but strong dynasty comes in and forces society to come back together, and it imposes its will on society, and it achieves political integration. I think that's precisely the term that she uses. And so it achieves political integration. There's now one person in charge, and they're powerful enough to coerce the rest of society to behave. But she said that it then takes a longer time in the next long-lived dynasty to develop what she called cultural integration. But it's the same as social cohesion. She's just using different words. But it's about the Chinese people becoming one, sharing their identity and feeling that, we all have common interests and we're going to pull together. So political integration can be achieved quite quickly. If you're strong and powerful enough, you can force people to do what you want, but you can't make them like each other. That takes a longer time for them to develop this sense of fellowship and desire to cooperate with each other. So that is the cultural integration, as Cameron called it, or social cohesion. And that draws attention to the fact that some people don't use the term social, they use cultural, because we also use the term social to mean anything to do with society. So the political and economic could be considered kind of part of social science, for example. So they're part of the social properties of humanity. So we do use social in a broader sense, as well as in this narrower sense. So we can have social to incorporate all of these dimensions, or just social as something distinct from political and economic. So to avoid the confusion, as I say, some people use cultural for that, or possibly sociocultural. And it's why I called this lesson sociological dimensions rather than just social dimensions, to make clear that I'm going to be using social in this lesson in this narrower sense, so as kind of not to avoid confusion. And also sometimes people use the term societal to mean anything to do with society rather than social. Again, that's to avoid the confusion between the broader and the narrower sense. But I kind of find, although I do use it to some extent, I kind of find it a bit clumsy to use sociocultural, and cultural doesn't quite do it for me. So I prefer to use social, but so long as we recognise that we mean it in its narrower sense, to refer to these cooperative relationships. And also, Cameron used integration, so she called it, in our terms, social integration as opposed to political integration. But again, I think it's better to use a different term. I mean, we could call this political integration, economic integration, and social integration. And some people do that or something similar to that. But again, I prefer to have different words here so that we can talk about integration, organisation and cohesion, and we don't need to specify the political, economic and social because it's implicit in that. But these are all matters of personal preference and what might catch on. But it's just to be aware that there are these issues of terminology. And in fact, many people have identified these three dimensions and talked about these three dimensions of society using their own idiosyncratic terminology. So they're saying, this is my model and it involves this, this and this. And they're really talking about these same three dimensions, but they're just using different words for it. So I'm going to put up now some of those other sets of terms that people have come up with. Okay, so these are some different authors and their systems of social dimensions or sociological dimensions. So Kenneth Boulding, the economist, we've heard his name a few times now, he talked about the threat, the exchange and the integrative. So the coercive, threat, contractual, exchange and cooperative, integrative. So you can see he used integrative here in this sort of cultural integration sense rather than political integration. And the reason he actually chose these names is because he talked about them the other way around. So it was threat, integrative, exchange, and that stands for TIE, tie, and he said that's appropriate because these are the relationships that tie people together in society through threats, through these integrative, cooperative, as in our terms, relationships, and also through exchange relationships. They tie people together, make them interdependent. But as you can see, they're the same concepts, the same dimensions. Then a historian, Crutwell, came up with power, subsistential and metaphysical dimensions of society. So power is really about politics, it's about coercion. Subsistential is about how we gain our subsistence. So it's how we make a livelihood. So it's really about the economic side of life. And metaphysical is about our ideas and values, our philosophy of life, and that's the kind of thing that makes us feel we have shared interests with our fellow people who have the same metaphysical outlook. So again, he's really picking up on the same dimensions. Peter Sorokin talked about the compulsory, contractual and familistic dimensions. So compulsory, coercive means the same thing. He's in fact used the same term as we're using, contractual and familistic, so to do with your family relationships, and those are what we're talking about with cooperative relationships based on love and liking for people, and that's why you behave cooperatively with them. You do things just to because you want them to be happy. Familistic. And then Rudolf Steiner had the terms political, economic and spiritual cultural. Spiritual cultural. So apart from those two, he's only got one that's different, spiritual cultural as opposed to social. But we talked about socio-cultural, so cultural certainly part of it, and spiritual again, it's about your as Putwell's picking up on with metaphysical, it's about your worldview, your outlook on life, your values, and it's the sharing of values with other people that makes you feel aligned with them. And I suppose I might say here that it's spiritual because also religion is a big part of this. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but religion is certainly part of this dimension because it is about that the church is about sharing values and interests with other people, feeling part of a common body. So yes, the religion, and hence the use of the word spiritual there. Then Michael Mann, who's a social theorist who's written books, a series of books called The Sources of Social Power, and he looks at the sources of social power through history, says there are not 3 dimensions but 4 dimensions. And he says they are the political, the military, the economic and the ideological. Well, as you can see, I've lumped the political and military together and put them under the political, the coercive, because really the military is another kind of coercive function within society. So I will use political in a broader sense to include the military. It's the political is really anything that is coercive in society, anything where it's non-optional. Yes, so we really come back to 3 dimensions if we recognise that these are not really distinct. They're really referring to coercive forms of behaviour, or what say Sorokin called compulsory, or about threat and power. Military is as much about threat and power as political. And then Carol Quigley has 6 dimensions: the political and military, the economic, and the social, the intellectual, and the religious. And as you can see, again, we can lump those 2 together. They're really about the coercive dimension. And his social, intellectual, and religious also all tend to be about the cooperative. Social, certainly, because that's already, we're using that term. Intellectual, well, it's about your ideas and values, which is the kind of thing that makes you feel, these people share my ideas, share my values, therefore I have an interest in helping them out. And that's the same with religion. These people are the same religion as me, they have the same values, I owe them charity. So, as I say, although people are always inventing new schemes, they tend to come back to these three dimensions, because really these are the only three ways only three different ways that we can influence people's behaviour and that determine the characters of social interactions. And I also said it's useful knowing about these because they help us think about socio-historical phenomena in a way that makes sure we don't miss anything out. And what I mean by that is, if we think about something like the church, we might say, well, the church, is on the social side of life. But in fact, the church has political and economic aspects as well. So if we say, let's think about the church, and let's think about the political, the economic and the social. We ask ourselves, well, what's the social aspect of the church? How does it function in the social dimension? And that's fairly obvious. It's all about religion and sharing values, the kind of thing I've been talking about. So we can identify that. But what about the economic aspect of the church? Well, the church has to pay for itself, and there are economic aspects to the church and contractual aspects to the church. I mean, for example, churches perform weddings and they charge people to do that. So there is a sense in which society pays the church to perform its function. And then what about the political aspects of the church? Well, particularly in the past, the church has had power in society and been able to force people to behave in certain ways. So it does have a coercive element. Obviously, the social cooperative side is absolutely dominant, but there are aspects to the way the church functions that we might miss if we don't have this in our mind to think, well, what about the economic aspects? What about the political aspects? So whenever you come to some new phenomenon, you can say, check off, well, what's the social implications of this? What's the economic implications? What's the political implications of this? So another possible example is, say, the financing of terrorist organizations. We want to study that and understand it. How do terrorist organizations fund themselves? Well, we apply this. We say, well, what are let's say the political aspects? That's about coercion. Well, terrorists extort money from people through threats of violence. So there's a political aspect to terrorist financing. What about the economic aspects? Well, sometimes they participate in drug running, for example, or they support petty crime and they make money that way. Or if they've stolen resources, like terrorists in the Far East have acquired access to oil, which they can then sell on the black market. So there's an economic aspect to their financing. And what about the social side? Well, well-wishers may give money to a terrorist organization, like, for example, the IRA used to raise money in America with people who sympathized with their cause. So there are political, economic and social aspects to terrorist financing. And if we use that idea of the three dimensions, we're not going to miss anything when we think about that topic. And now we'll move on to our next issue, which is scale. So consider downtown New York City and a village in the Amazon jungle. Clearly they have different political, economic and social institutions. But there's something else, because in downtown Manhattan, you've got millions of people moving around, and the whole city is buzzing with activity. Whereas in the Amazon village, there's very few people, and they spend a lot of their time just lying around in hammocks. So the difference is what we call scale. It's a difference in scale. And so this is a fourth sociological dimension. So I've been saying there were 3 dimensions, but that was just to keep things simple to start with. There's actually this 4th dimension of scale, but it's different from the other 3 dimensions because the political, economic and social dimensions describe the quality of social interaction. Whereas scale is about the quantity of social interaction. So political, economic, social is about the type of interaction that's taking place, whether it's coercive, contractual or cooperative. It's about the quality of that interaction, whereas scale is about the amount of interaction. So just the sheer amount of interaction is much higher in New York City than it is in an Amazon village. And I said that when we look at theorists' ideas about sociological dimensions, we tend to find that they really correspond to our basic 3 dimensions once we look at them in the right way. And if they say there's more than 3 dimensions, we find that we can lump them together and they really just correspond to one or other of our dimensions. But that's not always the case, and we'll consider the sociological dimensions of the theoretical historian Stephen Sanderson, who talks about 5 dimensions: the political, the economic, the ideological, the technological, and the demographic. So he's got 5 dimensions. Now, if we look at these, well, the political is obviously our political dimension, and the economic is obviously our economic dimension, and the ideological, I hope by now you would, immediately recognise this is a social dimension. It's about values, beliefs, and those things, the extent to which those things are shared with other people. Religion and societies, families, this kind of thing. But what about these? Technological. Well, that doesn't really fit political, economic or social. Or demographic is about human numbers. Again, doesn't really fit. Well, these are measures of scale. So the demographic is about the number of people, and the more people, the higher the scale. More people, more social interaction, higher scale. And technological is or affects your ability to interact with other people. So if you've got cars and roads and telephones, you can interact with a lot more people than if you back in the Stone Age and you don't have those things. So technology is about increasing scale. Increases in technology effectively increase scale. So the technological and demographic dimensions really are parts of aspects of our dimension of scale. So we can say that when we're thinking about scale, what we're picking up on, scale is a measure of population size. So certainly more people, more interaction, higher scale. It's also dependent on population density. So if you take the population of New York City, if you were to spread it out across the entire world, as it was in the Stone Age, that was about the population of the world, people would find it a lot harder to interact, and interaction would be much lower, so scale would be lower. It's only because they're brought together into this small space that they're able to interact so frequently and so intensively. And then the last thing contributing to scale is, I'll call it reachability. So it's what we were talking about here with the technology. It's how fast you can travel around, how far you can communicate over. So, letters, when writing and letters and postal systems came in, it increased the reachability of the population and it increased scale. And then when email came in, it vastly increased reachability because you can now communicate much faster and more easily with lots of people. So reachability contributes also to scale. These three things are the things that tend to make it up. And as I said, we can say that it's a measure of the intensity of social interaction. And you may have noticed as I'm talking that when I'm talking about social interaction, I'm using social in a broader sense to mean anything to do with society. So, this is just, I don't think there's really any difficulty in coping with these distinctions. But it's to bear in mind that social can have this broader sense, but it's also got a narrower technical sense that we are using in our terminology for this theory. And if that annoys you, you can go to socio-cultural or cultural. And notice also that there's an interaction, that scale to some extent affects political, economic and social institutions, because I said about the Amazon village, the low scale of the Amazon village is associated with pretty much an absence of political and economic dimensions. It's really only social because there's only a dozen or so people perhaps in the village. So this is your family. So you only interact with them in cooperative ways. There's no police and law courts. There's no coercion. There's not really anyone in charge in a formal sense. And similarly, there's no economic organisation, no contractual relationships. There's very little division of labour, no formal contractual behaviour of, I'm going to do this for you so long as you do that for me. So with such low scale, everything is cooperative, and it's only as human numbers grow and scale increases, so it's not just the increase in numbers but also the increase in population density and reachability that creates this increase in interaction that makes these things start to become important. You need some kind of division of labour, and you start to trade with people to get what you need. You can't do everything for yourself, and also you need some kind of coercive institutions to keep order among such a large number of people. So yes, there's an interaction between scale and the political, economic and social dimensions. And I've done this as a double-headed arrow because arguably it's the other way around as well. If you did not have suitable economic institutions and suitable political institutions, then a high-scale society would become unbearable. Imagine if all the millions of people in New York City, suddenly all economic relationships disappeared, the supermarkets closed down, and there was no way to buy food, clothes, etc. The people would have to flee the city. They couldn't live. They would starve to death. Similarly, if the political structures broke down, crime would become intolerable, and again people would flee the city. So if you haven't got the suitable political, economic and social institutions, then scale cannot be high. People will spread out and scale will automatically reduce. So that's why I put a double-headed arrow. And we can also see this in something that the sociologist Herbert Spencer said about long-term trends in historical evolution. So I hope I can just fit that on the bottom here. Herbert Spencer, long-term historical trends involve an increase in, he said, 5 things: human numbers, the concentration of the human population, social stratification, and then specialization and organization, that's supposed to say. So when he's talking about increase in human numbers, he's talking about an increase in scale. And when he's talking about an increase in the concentration of those increased numbers of people, he's also talking about scale. So numbers and concentration, as we said here, population size and population density, there's been an increase in scale, is basically what he's saying. Then stratification. So that's about having an elite, rulers, and people at the bottom of the pile, the peasants, and maybe some in between, the knights. So there is this hierarchy in society, this stratification, and that is about creating coercive relationships in society, this pyramid from the ruler down to the ordinary people at the bottom. Social stratification is about the political institutions. And then lastly, with specialization and organization, well, he separates them out, but you know, we talked about them as really aspects of the same thing. As I said, there's no point in having economic organization if there's no specialization. The organs of the body perform different functions. There would be no point in having organs that all perform the same function. So the specialization of the organs is a necessary and essential part of having organs. If they didn't specialize, if they were all the same, there would be no need for them to interact, because they could do everything for themselves. There's nothing any of the other organs could do that they couldn't do themselves. So without specialization, there's no point in organization, and organization really implies specialization. So these two things really again go together and are part of what we called the economic side of life, the economic dimension. And so when Spencer's talking about these trends, he's really talking about this relationship, that as scale has increased, it's led to an increase in economic behaviour and an increase in political behaviour. So like the Amazon village has really no economic and political institutions to speak of because it is at low scale. But as scale has increased towards the levels of New York City, then economic and political dimensions have become important. So let's move on to our next topic, which is all about interaction between the dimensions. We've already seen that there's an interaction between scale and the other three dimensions, but we'll now be talking about interaction between those three qualitative dimensions themselves. So if we take something like the church and the police and ask ourselves what dimension of society do those institutions belong to, we can say, well, the church is all about the social dimension. It's all about, cooperation and caring for your fellow humans, your fellow members of society. And the police is all about the coercive dimension. So it's all about the political dimension. It's about forcing people to obey the law under the threat of being hauled off to jail. But as we've already seen with the church, although it's mainly social, it also has political and economic dimensions as well. So it's actually political, economic and social. And we can make a similar argument for the police, that although the police is largely about coercion, there's also an economic aspect to the police, because we expect that we pay our taxes to the police to fund the police, and in return they keep down crime and stop us being burgled and ensure that traffic flows freely on the roads and that kind of thing. So there's a contractual relationship to our relationship with, or contractual aspect to our relationship with the police. It's they do something for us as we do something for them. And there's also a social aspect, because when we obey the police, we don't just necessarily obey them just because we're afraid of being arrested or beaten over the head with a truncheon or something. We obey them because we think they're doing a good job, and we recognise the value of their work, and we want to cooperate with them. Perhaps sometimes when we don't necessarily agree, we will still obey them because we think, well, that's the decent thing to do, and to help cooperate with them. So the police is not just political, it's got political, economic and social aspects. And we'll find this is true of every institution we might look at. And that is because you can never really see one of these dimensions in a pure form. If you take, for example, the political dimension, and you imagine a ruler who tried to rely, a ruler of society that is, who tried to rely solely on the political dimension, solely on coercive relationships. So they got people to behave in the way they wanted purely through force. Well, they would have to be forcing everybody all the time. It would be absolutely exhausting. They'd have to force the people around them to force other people to do things. It would just be impossible. You could not rely solely on coercion. Even if the ruler sat in their palace with a machine gun or something, they could not control the whole society through fear and through that threat. So what they do have instead is a sense of legitimacy. They need some kind of legitimacy, which means that people accept that they are the rightful ruler and it is the right thing to do to obey them. So there is some sense in society of a cooperative relationship with the ruler. We share some values and we share some interests. Somebody needs to rule. This is our ruler. They're our legitimate ruler. We will obey them for that reason. We don't have to be forced into our behaviour at every moment. And also with the ruler, there's an element again of a quid pro quo, as with the police. We pay our taxes, but we don't do that purely because we're forced, and we don't do it purely because we love politicians so much. Far from it. It's big, but we do it because we feel that we get something out of our taxes. We get roads and social insurance and the military protecting our country from outsiders and so on. So every institution is going to have political, economic and social aspects. It cannot rely solely on a single dimension. And sometimes the dimensions reinforce each other. So, for example, if we take something I've just been talking about, legitimacy, which is about the social dimension, the legitimacy of the government or the ruler increases the authority of the ruler. It means that the ruler's right to rule is recognised, and so the greater the legitimacy, the greater the authority of the government. If they have no legitimacy, then they've got no authority over us. People are much less likely to obey them. But if people recognise their legitimacy, then they will obey. So the social dimension tends to enhance the operation of the political dimension. But the interaction can also undermine. One dimension can undermine the other. So we might say that if we have excessive cooperative relationships, so we result in over familiarity. So familiarity means in the sense of friendliness, if you like, which is an aspect of social relationships, and I'll just put over familiarity. But friendliness, familiarity is going to undermine the ability to project power, because if you're too friendly with people, then it's very difficult to force them to do things when you need to. So it can produce weakness in the political authority. So and I use that because of the phrase familiarity breeds contempt. If an officer is over familiar with their soldiers, they'll find it more difficult to get those soldiers to obey their orders when they need to. So the social dimension can undermine the political dimension. Two strong cooperative relationships can weaken political relationships. But I also said that strong cooperative relationships can produce strong political relationships. So there's an interaction, but it can be both reinforcing and undermining. And I'll give another example of that. So if we talk about a political weakness, let's say, so we've got a lack of political effectiveness, a weak political dimension. Political weakness can lead to an increase in crime, which can lead to increase in it means an increase in shoplifting and general disorder in society, which means it's harder for businesses to operate, which means that the economy will get poorer, the economy will weaken. The economy will weaken. So political weakness leads to economic weakness. Now this is another example of a reinforcing relationship. So although it seems a bit perverse to say it's reinforcing when it's making the economy weaker, what this means is that here a negative change in the political dimension will have a negative effect downstream on the economic dimension. So the change in the political system is reinforced in the economic dimension. So when I said reinforce, what I meant was that a positive increase in the social dimension, an increase in legitimacy, has a positive effect on the political dimension. It increases authority. But when we said undermine, we meant it's the opposite. It works the opposite way. So that a positive increase in the cooperative dimension, an increase in familiarity, more feelings of identity with, and caring for each other, can produce political weakness. So that's a negative effect. So they go in opposite directions. And going back to this, the political and economic interaction, we can also say that if the government is too strong, then it can suppress innovation. It can reduce freedom and creativity. For example, the government has lots of regulations to supposedly increase safety, and that means it allows people less scope to experiment around with things and maybe come up with new inventions. So or develop new economic relationships. So the result is that it reduces economic enterprise and leads to economic weakness. And I think we just need to look around the world and we can see how dictators can produce economic weakness in their societies. So this is where a positive on the political dimension, political strength, produces a negative on the economic dimension. So what we've seen is that social affects political, political affects economic, and the social affects political both in a positive, reinforcing way and in an undermining way and in the opposite way, and the same for political and economic. And we can draw all three dimensions, and I won't talk through all of them, but if we consider all of them, we will find that they all interact with each other. So we've got here an example of how the political affects the economic, and we find that it can reinforce, be positive, but it can also be undermining, negative. We found that let's put it there. We said the social, there can be, there's many relationships, because there's this was about the political affecting the economic positively and negatively. But we'd also find, if we wanted to argue through, that we could find that arguments to say why the economic dimension can affect the political dimension in reverse. So, for example, if you have a strong economy, you'll probably raise more taxes, which makes the government able to do more things and become more effective. So the strong economic dimension can produce a strong political dimension. And we can also argue how a strong economy can weaken the political dimension. And we've had here the social affecting the political in a positive way and also in a negative way. And we can then, we find we could construct arguments that it also works the other way. Political can affect social, and again, both reinforcing and undermining. And the same for this last one, which we didn't discuss, but economic to social. So we have a very complex picture that there are these interactions between these dimensions. And one of the mysteries of it is how can it be that simultaneously they can affect each other, both reinforcing and undermining. And that will bring us on to our next topic. So let's now talk about perception and reality. And the investor George Soros, in his book The Alchemy of Finance, talks about a concept he calls reflexivity. And George Soros says in his book that when he started out in life, he wanted to be a theoretical historian. But he tried to do that for a year or so and didn't really get very far in discovering a theory of history and society. So he went into investing, which he regarded as a kind of practical way of testing his theories about society and social evolution. And he's rather successful at that. So his theory of reflexivity that he presents in his book, The Alchemy of Finance, is not just a kind of investment concept. It's it's coming from somebody who's interested in theories of history. So let's write up reflexivity. And I've written price. So what Soros is talking about is the price of a financial instrument, like a share in a company or a company stock, whatever term you use. So that has a certain price. And Soros says that is what people believe it to be worth. It's what they're prepared to pay for it. So it's a matter of people's belief about what it's worth. But there is also what the financial professionals call the fundamentals of a company and of its stock, which determine what it's really worth. So the fundamentals refers to how successful the business is, how good its plans are for going forward, in what the quality of its staff are like. These fundamentals give you the real value of the business. So we will use the term value to describe those fundamentals. So there's the price of the share, and there's also the value of the share, the true value of the share. And these things aren't the same. Price is what people think it's worth, value is what it's really worth. And it's not very controversial to suggest that the value is going to affect the price. If a company is doing really well, people are going to notice that and think, oh, it's worth getting those shares. They believe that they're worth something, and so it will have a high price. So the higher the value, we would expect the higher the price. The lower the value, if the company is failing, then the price will fall. So value affects price. But this is then the key aspect of Soros's theory, that it also works the other way, that the price affects the value. And in his financial terms, he says that, for example, if the company has a high share price, it's easier for it to go and raise money, because when it goes to the banks and say, we need £10 million to build a new factory, the banks look at the company's share price and see that it's strong, it's been rising, the chart is going up. They think, the price is high of the shares of this company, it's obviously a good bet. So they will be more prepared to lend it money. And as they lend it money, then it means it can build that new factory and expand its operations, sell more products, and so the company increases in value. So that share price has made it possible for the company's true value to increase. This is reflexivity then. Value affects price and price affects value. And we also said that these are, price is people's beliefs, so it's people's perception of what it's worth. And the value is what it's really worth, the reality. And so we can extend Soros's idea to the dimensions that we've been talking about and society in general, that for each of our dimensions of society there are perceptions about what those, what the situation is with them. So if we're talking about the political dimension, there's a perception of the political integration, and then there's the reality of the political integration, what it really is. And again, Soros's idea of reflexivity applies here, so that if there's a perceived high integration of society, in other words, people perceive that the government is powerful and strong, then it makes it easier for the government to raise taxes, because people are more likely to pay their taxes because they believe that the government can enforce its tax rules. And so when people then pay their taxes, the government has a strong income, and so it can afford more tax inspectors and more police and so on. So the government becomes strong in reality. So the perception that the government is strong can make the government stronger in reality. And also, of course, the other way around, if the government is genuinely strong, so it has lots of police on the streets, then that's likely to increase people's perception that the government is strong. So there is this reinforcing reflexivity as Soros describes it. Now, this can work in a virtuous circle, so that increasing real value of the share or increasing real integration of society can produce an increased perception of integration, or an increased perception of the value of the share, or in other words, the price. And then that increased perception can increase the reality. And so it just keeps going round in a virtuous circle. But if it changes direction, it can go the other way. So if the price is falling, it makes it harder for the company to raise money, which reduces its value. People notice that it seems to be doing less well. The price falls further, and so you switch into a vicious circle. And again, if the government is perceived to be weak, then it makes it harder for it to raise the money to be strong. So it actually becomes weaker in reality, which makes people perceive even more that it's weak, and so the whole thing starts to unravel. And this is perhaps partly, anyway, an explanation as to how we can have that situation I was just talking about, where these three dimensions have both positive and negative effects on each other. It may be that it's the positive political issue. It's the perceived integration that affects the real economic organization in a positive way, and the real political integration that affects the perceived organization in a negative way. So it's possible that is how they can have seemingly contradictory effects on each other. It's because it's not just the political dimension affecting the economic dimension, it's the perceived and the real political dimensions affecting the perceived and the real economic dimensions. Which is, not something though that we will be addressing explicitly here, but it's, as I say, a useful idea to have these ideas in the back of our mind, because when we're thinking about socio-historical phenomena, we can start to think about, remember that for everything we're talking about, there's the perception and the reality. And the perception is what we see. We can see the price of a share very easily. We just look it up in the newspapers or online these days. But the reality, what the company's really worth, well, that's very arguable. You can, get hold of the company's prospectus and things and go through it and try and work out what you think it's really worth. But there's a lot of judgment involved and a lot of uncertainty. So reality is hard for us to see, but perception is what we actually detect. And so we think when we're talking about integration, organisation and cohesion and even scale, we are generally talking about our perception of them, not necessarily the reality. So it's worth bearing that in mind when we're thinking about socio-historical phenomena. And we'll now move on to the final topic, which is about the existence of internal and external aspects to our sociological dimensions. So if we take a particular society, it consists of lots of people, and they're all interacting with each other. And out of these interactions, which may be coercive, contractual or cooperative, we get the integration, organisation and cohesion of that particular society. So it has these political, economic and social aspects, the political integration, the economic organisation and the social cohesion, which depends on the particular pattern and strength, intensity of the social interactions. So we can say that it has a certain internal integration, organisation and cohesion. That is the integration, organisation and cohesion of that society. But this society is also interacting in a world with other societies. And we can also have political, economic and social interactions between the societies. So this society might coerce that one. If it's the Roman Empire conquering Spain and Gaul, then it's coercive, it's imposing its will. Or it might be today the United States dictating to other countries how they should behave. So there may be a coercive aspect to the interaction between societies. There can also be an economic relationship, naturally, because countries trade with each other. And there can also be social aspects to the interaction between societies, because societies can form alliances, for example. So, the NATO is a group of countries that are joined by a set of cooperative relationships. So there is this external political, economic and social interaction. So there is an external integration, organisation and cohesion. We can ask if the world as a whole is integrated, organised and cohesive. So if this society if this society is integrated in itself, That doesn't tell us necessarily about how the world is integrated. It depends on the whether there is a powerful society in the world that can force it, impose its will on other societies and create order in the world as a whole. And the point then again is that there is an interaction between the internal and the external integration, organisation and cohesion. Just the same as we said there was an interaction between perception and reality, and an interaction between the political, economic and social dimensions. So let's just take an example of that. If a country is strong and powerful, has a strong, powerful government and a strong economy and a strong social cohesion, then it makes it easier for it to dominate other countries that might be weaker. So the internal integration, organisation and cohesion change the extent to which there is going to be a coercive relationship among countries. If a country is internally integrated, organised and cohesive, then it can make the world as a whole integrated, organised and cohesive, because the United States dominates the world politically, it dominates it economically, and it dominates it socially as well. It has gathered around it all the countries of NATO because it's an economic powerhouse. It tends to drive world trade, and as we've already talked about, is able to impose its will on other countries. As it starts its integration, organisation and cohesion deteriorate, then its ability to do those things in the rest of the world deteriorate, and the integration, organisation and cohesion of the world as a whole may decline. But it also works, as ever, the opposite way as well, that if the world is more integrated, it's more peaceful. So it's easier for countries to trade. If your ships are crossing the ocean, and there's a lot of pirates because the world is not integrated, there's no one in charge who's able to keep down piracy, then economic interaction between countries will decline. But if there's a strong, powerful world leader, it can keep down piracy and make not just itself but other countries be able to trade more freely, and that will increase the economic organisation of the world. And so on and so forth, with all the possible combinations, there is an interaction. So I've focused on the political, economic and social, but we can also say this for scale, that there can be an internal scale, an internal intensity of interaction, and an external intensity of interaction. And the same is true, I didn't mention it, for perception and reality. There can be the perceived scale, the perceived intensity of interaction, and the real intensity of interaction. So what we have is, well, let's get rid of this and I'll finish up with a final diagram. So let's bring everything together in a final summary. We've got our four basic dimensions: political integration, economic organisation, social cohesion and scale. And we can sort of draw a distinction between those. These are qualitative dimensions, and that's the quantitative dimension. And that's 4 dimensions. And then for each of these, we've got a perceived and a real aspect. So that gives us double. We've got 2 for each of these, so that's 8 dimensions in total. But then also we've got the internal and the external systems. So that doubles up again, giving us a total of 16 different dimensions. And then each of these dimensions can interact with any of the others. So, for example, the internal perceived integration can interact with the external real cohesion, let's say. And not only that, but it can be undermining or reinforcing under different circumstances. And the same applies for all other possible combinations. So we end up with a very complex picture. And the point of this framework is that it's a useful thing to bear in mind if you're analysing a particular socio-historical situation, because you can say, if you're looking at, for example, the development of banking in a particular country, you can ask yourself, well, what are the political, economic, social aspects, and what is the impact of scale? So things like technology and population growth. So you can look at the integration, organisation, cohesion, and scale, and how of the society, and how those were relevant to the evolution of banking, and how the banking affected those things. But you also say, but we mustn't forget though that there's the perceived and the real aspects. So, are we looking at the perceived, and what was happening really underneath what we can perceive? And then you can say to yourself, and what about also the internal and external aspects? So banking in this society was not just developing in isolation, most likely, but it was developing as part of a wider regional or world system. And so how did those internal and external relationships affect it? So to repeat, the value of this framework is to make sure that when you're examining things, if you use this as a kind of checklist, you're not going to miss anything.